Hello and welcome, friends, to the Discussion of Tapes program. In the course of this series, I will be taking you on a ride through the history of one of music's greatest formats. That's right, the humble cassette tape. Each video in the Discussion of Tapes program will cover 3 different cassettes. Something new from one of the many independent labels producing high-quality cassette tapes to this day. Something classic from when this format was at the peak of its power, and something weird which can only come from a format which has such a lengthy and prolific and versatile history. To begin, we'll talk about Deerhoof's Isla Bonita. This is really not very new. It's about 5 years old, from 2014, and this is the tape that I received on this album's launch day. I was very, very excited for this. I was a sophomore in college, and I remember the 2012 album released by Deerhoof, Breakup Songs, was my favorite record of that year, still one of my favorite records of all time, and the album immediately preceding it, The Magic, is also one of my favorite records ever, and not necessarily my favorite of that year, but still, regardless, one of my favorite albums. And I was very excited for La Isla Bonita. I actually pre-ordered, this is the only time I've ever done this, I pre-ordered the album from Polyvinyl Records' website. That's not the first time I pre-ordered something, but it was the first time I pre-ordered something, and I bought it on tape and on CD, and I bought the shirt bundle with it. It must have cost like $50. This is just a very good album to have on cassette, actually. Deerhoof is a band very well suited for cassette. Coming from kind of a noise background, they don't need necessarily like an FLAC for you to get the full feel of them. I listened to their live album that they put out a few years ago and was struck by the fact that, like, yeah, for the most part, it's their emotion and their energy that really makes the band something. It's not so much about like heavy technical play. It's not something where I need high fidelity. To an extent, actually having a little bit rougher of a fidelity, a rougher experience actually kind of adds to it. It goes more in line with what Deerhoof probably would like their music to sound like, coming from a tape speakers like Jensen back here. So this is thematically strange and kind of thematically inconsistent, considering how strong Deerhoof is on a thematic level with most of the records they've put out since 2009's Offend Maggie, another one of my favorite albums ever, just to say. To put it in one way, Breakup Songs from 2012 was very electronically influenced, and this album does not really have an electronic influence, and the next album really didn't have an electronic influence, and then the one they put out in 2017 had a little bit more of one, but regardless, you have a sense of theming for each Deerhoof album. Each one sounds a little different. This doesn't sound as harsh as The Magic would later sound, and doesn't sound as electronically focused as Breakup Songs does, and it kind of just sits in its own little station with regards to Deerhoof history. Taking a look at the cassette itself, it's kind of bare bones when you look at it. The interesting thing that I take here is that this is a white tape with pink lettering on it, which really does not match like the album art or anything else. I believe this is, what do you call this, a J card? Or like the J card's pretty bare bones as well, just kind of the lyrics and the liner notes. But it's like this distorted black and white television looking thing here, and this would have probably fit with like Breakup Songs, which had kind of more pink lettering and stuff like that on it, but I don't know. This is kind of disappointing, honestly, because this was, I believe, their first cassette release with Joyful Noise Records, who primarily focuses on cassette releases, if I'm not mistaken, so I don't know, I guess like thematically it could do a little bit better, at least in the way it's made up. Regardless, this is an excellent album. The track that I would call my favorite on the album is the second to last track, Black Pitch, which is this melancholic Deerhoof track in the way that they like to make their melancholic tracks, where lyrically I don't know necessarily what it means. So you kind of make your own meaning, or at least I make my own meaning to it, and you just get into this really sweet section near the end of the track where it's just sotomy over a very light like guitar and like drum riff, and everything just kind of falls away. It's from a band where so much of their presence is going all out into this full force, into this just solid like wall of sound, not so much in the Warren Spector way, but in this just like a lot of sound sort of way. The quiet moments, I think they do so very well. And that really, I think, is the best aspect of this. Black Pitch is one of my favorite Deerhoof tracks. This might not be my favorite Deerhoof album. That doesn't mean it's a bad album. It just means it has kind of higher highs and lower lows than I think a lot of the rest of their output does. But I'd still recommend it. This is Moby's first and self-titled album, released in 1990. The most interesting thing about this album is the fact that old Richard Melville Hall did not want this released. I believe he wanted his first album to be the one he put out in 1992, Ambient, but the label put this out anyway after he did a series of EPs for his label under a couple different pseudonyms, where he would record 6 songs. 2 of them would be under the name Moby, and then 2 of them would be under 2 different names to give, I guess, the impression that there were more artists on his label. Go ahead and looking at the actual tape here. This is one of the unfortunate things about the early 90s is that people were just not like trying really with the art on the tape itself. This one's nice and yellowed from years of use. Got a nice stain there. This was bought secondhand, obviously. I wasn't alive when this album came out. My favorite thing about it is you got this nice artwork on the cover, and then if you flip it over, you get a nice tall portrait of Richard himself. This is before he was allegedly dating Natalie Portman, according to him. This is one of his more straightforward albums. The 90s Moby albums were filled with inconsistencies and just kind of general weird shit. It's why I love, and also at the same time don't listen to very often, his album Everything Is Wrong, because the highs of that album are the most balls out, ridiculous shit I've ever heard. Songs like Feelin' So Real, songs like Every Time You Touch Me, those are classics in the way that I think they sound great if I'm going 80 down a freeway in an old Buick with the windows down. And this one has a couple of songs like that, but knowing that like this wasn't necessarily meant to be like a full album, it kind of makes sense because there isn't a lot of like thematic clarity to this album. A lot of these songs just don't seem to go together. You'll have the intense, like, in your face, just like grittiness of a song like Ah Ah. You have songs like Have You Seen My Baby, which is super weird. You have Go, which is a remix of the Twin Peaks theme and really his first hit. It's an interesting listen, if not always the most satisfying, and strangely, it's an important album to me, really. I'm glad that I have this on cassette, that I was able to pick this up for $2 at a local record store, San Diego area record store owner, shout out. What was that record store called? Record City in Hillcrest, baby. So I was like 18, I downloaded this album the way that I used to when I was a kid because I was stupid. I would just download full albums off of Amazon MP3 for like $8 just to see if I liked them or not, before I knew what like streaming and stuff was. And I listened to this album like a lot my senior year of high school, going into my freshman year of college. I actually, this may have been the final time I did this, I burned the MP3s that I downloaded from Amazon onto a blank CD and played them in my Buick. And this is intrinsically connected to my first week at college. When I was 18, I didn't want to go to college, and I still went to college, and the university I attended was about 40 minutes away via highway from my parents' house. And on the drive there, I was nervous, and I was like shaky, and I didn't want to go, and I was like, oh God, why, I'm only doing this because I'm supposed to, and I was like 18, I didn't really, I kind of just did what I was supposed to with, what culture or whatever said I was supposed to do, and then it ended up working out fine, but whatever. I was just like so nervous and listening to this album, and I remember hitting the freeway and hearing what is track 2 on side 2, Help Me to Believe, which is, I imagine, a really good song to hear like at the crest of a rave in 1991, and pretty decent if you're in a Buick driving down the highway. And I was just sitting listening to that song, and I was like, man, I don't know, maybe things will be okay. And I remember the first time that I had like a break and was able to go home over like Labor Day weekend, I put that CD back in, and I was like, all right, well, as soon as I hit the freeway, I'm gonna listen to, I didn't even know, didn't even think of what the name of the track was. I probably just called it track 8 on the CD, and I was like, all right, as soon as I hit the freeway, that's when we're gonna hit Help Me to Believe. And then I hit stoplight after stoplight after stoplight, and I had to keep resetting, being like, all right, seek track, go back. And then once I finally got into a pretty good groove, I was finally able to have that moment that I wanted. But so that's nothing if not memorable. Thank you, Moby, for that. And this is a fine album, honestly. If you want to go back and just listen to, I actually recommend that everybody go through and listen to the Moby discography in order, because you really see somebody come into their creative spirit through the 90s. There are a lot of weird Moby tracks from the 90s and a lot of pretty normal ones from 1991 to 2004. That's when he was kind of at his biggest. That's when he started doing music for commercials, pretty much. And I don't necessarily mean that in the best way, though. I think 18's actually his best album, but whatever. Anyway, we're kind of going off the rails here. Let's talk about the next one. When it comes to something weird, what is a little bit weirder than an MTV one-hit wonder from the early 80s playing a live album in Australia, which was apparently also the final piece of music they released as a full band. This is Wall of Voodoo's The Ugly Americans in Australia, with an asterisk, because this is actually very funny. They write it on the J card here. It's typed out. Recorded at the Palace Theatre, Melbourne, Australia, by Greg Edward for Metropolis Audio, and with the asterisks, which is actually half of the album. The other songs are recorded at Big Joe's Bar and Grill in Bullhead City, Arizona. So, not fully in Australia, but I guess The Ugly Americans in Arizona doesn't sound quite as good. We can look back here on the back of the J card. We got a nice illustration. I assume those are the members of the band. The most important member of Wall of Voodoo is Stan Ridgway. Apologies to the other members of Wall of Voodoo. He apparently was doing movie soundtracks, and he still does movie soundtracks. I actually watched a short from 2016 which he did the music for. It was this sci-fi thing where, well, not really a sci-fi thing. It was a kind of suburban sci-fi thing. It was Walmart sci-fi, if people still use that phrase, but Walmart realism is like a literary movement in the mid. Whatever. It was this kind of suburban sci-fi thing where this guy had lost his wife after she got in a car after an argument, and he was trying to go back in time and stop him and his wife from having the argument. Ridgway's music and Ridgway's audio for the film was really good. It was really atmospheric, and I think did the job that he wanted his music to do for that film. Created a very good sense of eeriness around what was ultimately a hopeless situation. Sorry to spoil that for you, I guess, if you want, but it's, come on now. There is a really good episode on the history of Wall of Voodoo from the YouTube creator Todd in the Shadows in his series One Hit Wonderland, which really goes further into depth about what they did as a band, the kind of short career that they had. You probably only know Wall of Voodoo from their one hit called Mexican Radio, which was a song that got very big on MTV in the early 80s, because there was not a lot of good stuff on MTV in the early 80s. I remember in 2006, on the 25th anniversary of MTV's first broadcast, VH1 Classic showed a block of 6 hours of the first 6 hours of music videos that were on MTV in 1981. And while you had a couple of iconic classics, like Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles, and I remember that was the first time I ever saw, I was 11 at the time, I saw Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads, and that, like, whoa, you know, that's such a fascinating, like, cool video to see something really weird challenging the medium, really what is a new medium, and doing weird things with it. And a lot of artists ran with that. You had like Devo, and you had a lot of these new wave bands that could really effectively use the music video as a format for promotion, as well as creating something more out of their music. And then you also had like Joe Jackson and Supertramp and like Queen, who were just putting like concert footage out. You know, that was the thing that really struck me, was how few like actual music videos there were, and how many like live recordings of, you know, a classic rock band playing a song dotted the first few hours of MTV. And yeah, to talk about this album, it's fascinating. I really didn't expect to enjoy this as much as I did. They take an element of country music that you really didn't see very often as an influence in the alternative rock scene of that time period. I think there was more electronic and pop influence that was coming into kind of rock music in the 80s, but there is a lot of like that country western feel that I actually really appreciate. They do a weird cover of A Ring of Fire by Johnny Cash. And I think actually the standout track outside of Mexican Radio, which is actually one of my favorite songs from the 80s, is the song Wrong Way to Hollywood, which is on the first side, and really pretty entertaining. Just this whole album is pretty entertaining. They take a lot of risks as a band, and I know they broke up like shortly after this because they weren't like really ever going to be on the fast track to like superstardom like an REM would be. But it was still a really effective album. I actually would recommend you go find this if it's on Spotify, or just listen to Wall of Voodoo's general discography, because they're weird, and I appreciate that kind of good weird stuff that came out in the early half of that decade. So friends and fellows, thank you so much for coming with me through this odyssey of cassette tape history. I'll be back another time because I actually managed to pick up a brand new cassette tape from the year our Lord 2019. I actually have another one coming in the mail on the way. Very excited to do this series because you know, this kind of history of music fascinates me, and this format fascinates me too, really. It's just weird, but they can't seem to kill it. Cassette tape sales have actually gone up in the past few years, and I kind of understand why. It's sometimes just nice to have something in your hand, has some cool art with it, and you know, it's not as like unwieldy and expensive, and doesn't have quite as much snobbery attached to it as vinyl does. So not that vinyl's bad or anything, just like everybody on vinyl forums is very mean to me. So cassette forums don't seem to really exist, and they all seem to be pretty nice to me. So that's why you get my dollar. Cassette tape development studios, record labels, I think you're called. And as we always say, please be kind to me in the comments. I'll see you next time. The reason why I'm wearing fake glasses is because I'm insecure. I know what I'm working with here. And my normal glasses get caught in the glare when I use this room to film in, because the lights are like right at my face level, so I'm just looking right into the light. Does a decent job at lighting my face, but I don't want to subject y'all to that for an entire video. Anyway.